All right, it's time for concept 3.5, equilibrium in the ADAS model. Operates a lot like the equilibrium in the demand and supply, product market, and resource market, but it gives us different results. Instead of just price and quantity, it gives us price level and GDP. And then when we add long run average supply in there, it tells us where we're at on the business cycle. Let's do it. Okay, so whenever you're drawing an ADAS model, and we've done this a couple of times in class, you need to draw price level on the y-axis and real GDP on the x-axis. So real GDP, you can just put GDP. GDP subscript R works as well, and RGDP works as well. Okay, so we know that aggregate demand is downward sloping. We talked about this, the real balances or the wealth effect, the idea that when price level goes up, we get poorer and poorer. We know that short run aggregate supply, which you can also just call aggregate supply, you don't have to call it SRAS. We know that that is upward sloping because input prices are fixed, output prices are flexible. So when prices rise, the difference between the wages I pay and the prices I charge creates profitability. And so we see an increase in how much is going to be produced because businesses love profits. When profits go up, they produce more. And then finally, so AD and AS, they intersect, just like demand and supply intersect. At that intersection of what our entire economy is supplying, what our entire economy is demanding, we have our price level, or our CPI, Consumer Price Index, and our GDP, or our QY here, right? That's exactly where we want to be at this point. That's where our economy is, not where we want to be. That's where our economy is producing. Now, the indicator at the top of this slide says, hey, how do you show that this nation is at full employment? Well, we know that there's an indicator of full employment from our last video and from our talks in class. That indicator is long run aggregate supply. So how do I show that my economy is currently at long run aggregate supply? Well, I simply add long run aggregate supply to it. That's right. Instead of two curves, demand and supply, we have three curves on every ADAS model. We have aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply. Long run aggregate supply is just an indicator. It's a beacon at this point. We'll shift it at one scenario. But in every other scenario, it stays in the same spot. It's vertical, and it indicates full employment GDP. And so right here in this graph, it shows that we are at full employment GDP. We're exactly where we want to be as a society. How do we know? Because my current economy is wherever AD and AS intersect, just like my current price and quantity is going to be wherever demand and supply intersect in a product market. And those are intersecting on long run aggregate supply. So my current GDP is full employment GDP. Remember, long run aggregate supply is where we want to be. It's our beacon, right? And if we are currently producing on that curve as indicated right here, then we'll be at full employment GDP. We call this the triple intersection, where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply equals long run aggregate supply. If we are not here, we are either in a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap. And that means our economy has some work to do. So let's check it out. The economy can only be in three places, one of three places, at any given time. So let's check it out. Remember, we have our production possibilities curve right here. This right here is our business cycle. We know whenever we are producing inside of the curve, we have a recessionary gap, meaning we are currently producing too little. We have unemployment is high. We are in a recession. We indicate that as well here with any point below the curve. This one happens to indicate a trough. But really, any point below that growth trend line is going to be a recessionary gap. That means we are not at full employment GDP. We're not at the triple intersection. I'll show you what that looks like in a second on the ADAS model. The second place we can be is at full employment. We know full employment is on the production possibilities curve, anywhere on the production possibilities curve. On our business cycle, it's the intersection with the trend line, that upward trend. That means we're at full employment GDP. And then the final place we can be is an inflationary gap. We can temporarily produce beyond our capacity by overemploying and overspending, which can cause inflation, right? So that is a point outside of the curve here. And it's really any point above the trend line here. We just happen to have it at a peak. Now, those are the three places an economy can be at any given time. If you're in a recession or an inflationary gap, then you are not going to be at the triple intersection. The only time you're at the triple intersection is yellow here at the full employment GDP, on the production possibility curve, or on the growth trend line. Okay, let's check it out. So we are currently at full employment GDP. How do we know? Well, we know because aggregate demand and aggregate supply are intersecting on long run aggregate supply. Triple intersection, that's where we want to be. What if consumers increase consumer spending? What's going to happen? Well, we know that aggregate demand is made up of four elements: consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. If consumer spending is rising, that's an increase in consumption. When consumption rises, we know that aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. So I'll show that here, aggregate demand shifting to the right. What's going to happen? Well, I have a new equilibrium. I'm no longer producing at full employment GDP. I'm producing where AD1 and AS intersect, right here. So notice price level went up. What do we call that? Inflation. And then GDP went up to Q1. So what's going on here? We have an inflationary gap. Our current economy is producing beyond full employment. Our GDP is higher than the full employment GDP. We call that an inflationary gap. So there you go. Price level and quantity will increase as a result. Okay, let's try another one. Again, where are we starting here? Of course, it's full employment, triple intersection. Remember, long run aggregate supply is our beacon. It's where we want to be. So if we're currently producing on the beacon at the lighthouse, we are fully employed. Congratulations. Let's say the government increases spending. What's going to happen? Well, we know that aggregate demand is made up of four elements: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So government spending rises. When government spending rises, aggregate demand will shift to the right, just like the last one. When aggregate demand shifts to the right, what happens? Price level goes up and GDP rises. We're producing beyond the full employment GDP. Okay, so we call this an inflationary gap. Oftentimes it's shown like this. Long run aggregate supply says, here's where we want to be. This is our full employment. This is our beacon, right? Shining a light. We're not there. We overshot the mark. We're way over here, which means that our GDP is currently beyond full employment GDP, which means that our inflation is higher than it should be. And we call that an inflationary gap. So there you go. Because output is high and unemployment is low at this point, we call this an inflationary gap, which means that our unemployment rate is currently less than the natural rate of unemployment, right? In other words, if our natural rate of unemployment or full employment is 4 or 5%, we might have an unemployment rate of 2% at this point, and our inflation rate is likely to be high as well. That is our inflationary gap. In fact, you can label that gap as a distance between our full employment GDP and my current GDP. That would be my IG, or my inflationary gap. Okay, let's keep going. So where is it at on our other graphs? Well, we know we have a recessionary gap, a full employment, and an inflationary gap. If our ADAS model is intersecting to the right of full employment GDP, then we are red. We have an inflationary gap on our hands, meaning that we're temporarily producing beyond where we should be, and we are temporarily producing way up here nearing a peak. So inflation is high, unemployment is low. But in the long run, we'll go back to full employment GDP, which we'll show you a little bit later. Okay. Next, let's assume consumer spending falls. What's going to happen? Well, consumer spending falls. We know that one of four things can impact aggregate demand: consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. Consumption is falling in this case, which means that aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. When aggregate demand shifts left, our price level is going to fall and our GDP is going to fall. We have that new equilibrium. So are we still at full employment? No, because we're no longer intersecting long run aggregate supply. We're below full employment. We're producing too little. Unemployment rates are going to rise and inflation rates are going to fall. So there you go. Price level and quantity will both decrease when aggregate demand shifts to the left, producing less than full employment GDP. Okay, so what's that look like? We call that a recessionary gap. Here it is. A recessionary gap is AD and AS, which their intersection indicates where our economy currently is to the left of our long run average supply. We still have a long way to go to get to full employment GDP. We're producing too little. So our output is low, our GDP is low. Our unemployment rate is going to be higher than the natural rate of unemployment. So remember, full employment is 4 or 5%. We might be at 6 or 7 or 10% in this scenario, which means we are in a recession. In fact, you can label a recessionary gap. There you go, as the difference between our potential GDP, which is QY here, and our current GDP. That would be your RG, or your recessionary gap. Okay, so let's keep going. Where does that show up here? Remember, you have those three places you can be on the production possibility curve, on the business cycle, and in the ADAS model. Of course, we're in a recessionary gap. We're producing inside of the production possibility curve. So we know unemployment rates are high at that point. We're producing below our growth trend line. So we know that price levels are low and unemployment rate is high, or I should say price levels are stable. We'll talk about why a little bit later. So in the long run, yes, we will move up this cycle back to full employment. But in the short run, we are in a recession and it hurts. That's it. Check out Khan Academy 3.5, equilibrium in the ADAS model. Know that it indicates price level and GDP, and know the different gaps, recessionary and inflationary gaps, depending on where we're at relative to the long run aggregate supply. All right, peace.